All right, everyone. Welcome to week 5. Um, this week and next week as well, for this particular class, we're, of course, reading Democracy's Prisoner, which is about Eugene V. Debs. I've also put up on modules um, a couple of documents from Debs and Wilson to get you guys thinking of. And, of course, you should be reading in your textbook the section on World War One and Woodrow Wilson as well. Now, today's presentation is going to be probably a little bit longer. I'll just go ahead and say that right now. But that's because I wanted to kind of really lay out World War One. It's kind of hard to talk about Wilson and the United States without explaining what World War One was all about. And so we're going to look at Woodrow Wilson foreign policy, but most significantly, we're going to look at Wilson during, before, and after World War One. So, the myth of Wilson, I think, is that Wilson was a pacifist. And certainly, Woodrow Wilson was the first American president to hold a PhD. He's the only American president actually ever to hold a PhD. He was actually the president of Princeton University and was originally born in Virginia, but it was also governor of New Jersey. But Wilson, very much was an idealist. He had an ideal perspective on the world, and for that record, he was a pacifist. And the reality is, of course, that he used interventions quite often to achieve his goals. Um, his goals were, in his mind, the goal of greater peace and and uh, and freedom in the world. Those were the goals as he professed them. Um, he intervened actually quite a lot. He intervened 7 times, and oftentimes these interventions were based on these ideas of free trade, of democracy, of self-determination, and so on and so forth. In North America, he intervened in the Americas, particularly Mexico, most significantly. When the Mexican Revolution started, the United States was motivated to intervene to a large degree because the president of Mexico had nationalized oil fields in Mexico that were being controlled by American interests. Um, so he actually does, despite being a pacifist, he intervened quite a lot. But we being historians, refer to Wilsonian idealism, or what we might call sometimes the Wilsonian century, for a couple of reasons. Particularly because it's Woodrow Wilson who creates the idea, and he does this primarily through World War One, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But Wilson promoted the idea that only through these, there's others too, but only primarily through these key ideas could the United States be safe in the world, and not only the United States, but that only through these could there actually be an end to war in the world, if you will, the creation of a more just and more peaceful world. So collective security, the idea that the nations of the world would join together in like what you have in the United Nations today. Of course, during Wilson's time, the League of Nations. We'll talk about that later. Self determination was an ideal of Wilson's, that people should be able to determine their own governance, their independence, self determination. That concept obviously is a massive concept for us today. And self determination, the idea behind it, really motivated decolonization in the 20th century. Now, with that said, it's got to be noted that Wilson did not necessarily mean self determination for the people of the colonized world. Wilson did not extend his notion of self determination to, for example, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. Instead, there were these. It was really a thinking that he had for Europe, the what he would have considered the Western and most civilized part of the world. So that was what he intended. Democracy, of course, neutral rights. Wilson believed that the reason we had these wars was because there was all kinds of barriers and limitations on trade and movement of goods. And so he believed that there should be neutral rights and things like the high seas and global free trade. And he believed that through a collective of nations in the world, would maintain security and assure um, that there would be no wars in the future. He very much defined the problem in the cause of war as being based on the self-interest of individual nations, and Wilson intended to kind of replace that with um, a collection of nations that understood their place in a free world. So, before I get to World War One, I want to say, how many times do you think, because we say the Wilsonian century, how many times, has the U.S. claimed to be fighting for these goals? I mean, we can debate all we want what wars are really about sometimes, but it's still very important how policymakers justify what they're doing. And actually, when you look at the 20th century, major conflicts like Vietnam, Iraq, um, Bosnia, these wars were all fought behind the goal of promoting ideas of self-determination, of democracy, of collective security. And not necessarily every item that you see, but the idea behind Wilsonianism is really the idea that only through the promotion of democracy and self-determination and collective security can the United States really be at peace in the world and have a peaceful world. And so those are a few examples. There's many others, but those are a few examples that certainly historians would define as being driven by Wilsonian idealism, the idea that really the United States can only have peace when other countries effectively join our way of being in the world, if that makes sense. World War One, more than anything else, defined Wilsonianism, and I want to look briefly. It's kind of complicated, but I'll try to do it in the easiest way possible. But I want to look at what caused the conflict. Obviously, it's a European conflict, and the United States doesn't get involved in this war until the very end. April 1917 is when the United States declared war, and the war was over November 11th, 1918. But what caused it were lots of old disputes in Europe. The dispute over Alsace and Lorraine, which is on the border of France and Germany. That was an old dispute going back into the 1800s, even earlier. There was also an arms race, particularly a naval arms race between the British and the Germans. Germany, at the outset of the 19th century, Germany was a new country. Germany really had only become an independent sort of modern nation state in 1870. And so Germany tried to expand not only for its own defense, but it wanted to become a great power. Similar to how the United States during the Spanish-American War was really seeking to become a great power, so too did Germany. And so Germany, at the end of the 1800s, went on last-ditch colonizing missions to Asia, to Africa, and the Germans also built up a huge navy, and their goal was really to rival the British Navy. And it created an arms race, which created competition and also animosities between the British and the Germans. Also nationalism, and most specifically nationalism inside of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I'll show you a map in just a little bit so you can see these places that I'm talking about. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a huge empire, embodying much more than Austria and Hungary today. It had over a dozen different ethnic and linguistic groups within it. And lots of these groups, particularly Slavic groups, were very nationalistic and were moving for independence well before World War I began. But these nationalist movements were a distinct challenge to the authority of the Austro-Hungarians. And so there was this tension inside Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary was bound to have a war with Slavic nationalists. And what really created the bigger issue here is that these types of issues led European powers to create alliances with the enemy of their enemy, if you will. So, for example, Austria aligned with Germany. Germany and Austria were natural allies, and so Germany and Austria created a single alliance between the two of them. By contrast, Russia had a long-standing alliance with Slavic nationalists. They saw themselves in a similar cause. And so Russia and the Serbian nationalists, which were part of the Slavic nationalist movement, they were aligned. And then, of course, France was a longtime rival of Germany. And so when France realized that there was an opening for an alliance with Russia, because Germany had really failed to maintain a Russian alliance, France created an alliance with Russia for its own interest, in the sense that if Germany were to attack France, they could be assured that the Russians would attack the Germans from their rears, from the other side. And that was one of the big threats, big problems for Germany, was the threat of a two-front war. And so you had this intricate web of alliances that were rooted to animosities that went far back to nationalist resistance. Um, um, and so what happens is, you'll see when there's a spark, it's going to set these treaty alliances are going to tumble. This is a map, obviously. It shows you the original Axis powers and the original Allied powers. The Allied powers are in green: Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and of course, the Serbians, but in Slavic nationalists, but they're not terribly significant. Um, I mean, they do matter, but obviously. And then, of course, the brown were the Axis, and initially the Axis included Italy, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. I mean, and the Germans. Later, you're going to see, after the war begins, the Ottoman Empire joins the Axis, and the Italians will ultimately leave the Axis powers. Now, the catalyst for war, as is depicted in this painting here, is the assassination in Sarajevo of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. In fact, you can actually go to Sarajevo. They have they have a museum where the exact clothes that the Archduke was wearing that day are on display. You can see the exact items right there. I'm pretty sure the car is there too. Um, but this was a huge catalyst, because after this happens, you have these alliance systems falling into place. Russia, which had been under great pressure to support the Slavic nationalists, or the Serbian nationalists, Russia responds after Austria-Hungary demanded that it be allowed to go into Serbia and conduct its own military investigation. The Serbians refused. And after that point, the Austro-Hungarians declared war on Serbia. Once war was declared on Serbia, Russia then declares war on Austria-Hungary. Germany declares war on Russia because of their alliance with Austria-Hungary, and France declares war on Germany because of their alliance with Russia. Germany will then invade France, and Britain will declare war on Germany. So I know it's a little bit complex, but it's kicked off by the fact that what really starts it is, after this assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. Effectively, what happens is the Austro-Hungarians, after placing demands on the Serbians that could not be met, declared war on Serbia. And when that happens, all of these secret alliances fall into place.
And here you see a map that depicts the belligerent powers, with in brown the Central Powers, and in the green the Triple Entente of Britain, France, Russia, and of course later the United States. And the Central Powers were made up primarily of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire.
Now, Germany um, felt that it had to attack France, and it had to attack France first. And the best way to attack France was through neutral countries, because they would catch the French by surprise, and it might allow them to win a quick victory. Um, Germany feels they have to do this because they're facing a war between France and Russia. So you have two fighting forces on both fronts, and it was believed by German military strategists that Germany could not survive fighting a two-front war, that they had to be able to focus on one front or the other. And so the Schlieffen Plan was designed to alleviate this threat. Um, and so the Schlieffen Plan occurred, in which the Germans invaded France through the neutral countries, Belgium and the Netherlands. And the idea was they would catch the French by surprise and win an important victory. It took France only 6 weeks to mobilize their military, and by contrast, and actually took the Russians 12 weeks. So this is why they chose to go to France first. It's a smaller country, be easier to take it, and they're going to mobilize faster anyway. Of course, that fails. The war stabilizes and becomes a stalemate right around the Marne River. If you look on this map, you see the Marne River. Um, Loosely speaking, the Western Front stabilizes right there, and it becomes a stalemate. But the reason that this is important, aside from it becoming a stalemate, is that the German action of trying to attack France through the neutral countries was the first of two major actions that really vilified Germany and made them it ultimately led to them be labeled the culprit of World War One, which was unjust. That wasn't fair. It really was. It really was not a just treaty, but it was the action of going through the neutral countries first. That was the first thing that led to Germany being forced to sign what's called the War Guilt Clause. So, what kind of war was World War One? It's a war of attrition and it's an industrial war. What that means basically is obviously industrial war is pretty self-explanatory, but what it means is that the war bogs down. It becomes a war, a stalemated war that's fought largely in trenches. And it becomes a war in which many, many different industrial technologies are adopted to try to break the stalemate, but generally none of them work. And so it becomes what we call a war of attrition. And what a war of attrition is basically that the victor is the one who can effectively outlast the other. Grand strategies are basically, starving the other out. Blockades, using blockades, sinking merchant fleets, these types of things, depriving your enemy of the necessities that allow them to function as a nation and to make war. And so it becomes a long grind out to see who ultimately is less capable of withstanding the price of war, if that makes sense. It's really who can last the longest. And the ships you're looking at here are British ships that are enforcing a blockade in the North Sea against Germany, which was their fundamental. That was how the British were going to win this war once it became clear that on the Western Front, which is the front with France and Germany, where Britain and France are fighting the Germans, once it's clear that it's going to be a stalemate, it's going to be a stalemated trench war, they start to blockade Germany and start to deny Germany the ability to bring in supplies that can feed their people and supply the war. Germany can't do that. So another kind of reality for Germany is that Germany's only solution to answering the British blockade is unrestricted submarine warfare. It means if the British are going to blockade you, you have to basically go out there and sink any and every ship without any kind of warning that you think could be delivering goods to the British. And of course, most notoriously, the sinking of the Cunard White Star line ship, as you've seen pictured below, and you see the notice here, the travel notice for those that were sailing on the Lusitania. The sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915 was one of the real events after the invasion, the German invasion of France through Belgium. After that occurred, the next thing that really vilifies the Germans was this usage of unrestricted submarine warfare, and particularly the sinking of the Lusitania, in which well over 1,000 people died. The Lusitania, by the way, was sailing or steaming from New York back to Britain. The Lusitania was carrying munition supplies. And as you see right here, travelers on the Lusitania were warned that they were going into a war zone. And the map you see below with the blue area around those are the areas where the unrestricted submarine warfare and the blockade were most intense. And the Lusitania, Ireland, you see Ireland, the island next to Britain, the southern coast of Ireland, in sight of the coast is where the Lusitania sank. And when the Lusitania was struck by the U-boat, the submarine torpedoed it, The ship exploded quite significantly. There were other explosions and sank incredibly quickly, which made the death toll very high, but also was evidence to the fact that Wilson and the British both knew that that ship was shipping munitions to Great Britain under cloak of it being a passenger liner, because it was a passenger liner. But of course, Wilson's response was neutrality, to insist neutrality, and after the sinking of the Lusitania, he threatened to cut diplomatic relations, and actually the Germans stopped until really late 1916. The Germans stopped using unrestricted submarine warfare because they wanted to prevent the United States from getting involved, and instead they moved to a kind of submarine warfare that they would warn ships. They would surface and they would warn them, and then they would sink the ship, which was dangerous for the submarine crews. But they were trying to prevent the United States from joining the British in declaring war on them. Now, there's also something to be said about Wilson's neutrality. Wilson's neutrality was not total neutrality, and it really differed from the neutrality of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At the outset of World War II, Roosevelt had a complete neutrality. He said, we're not trading with anybody. But by contrast, Wilson said, rather than say we're not trading with anybody, Wilson said we have neutral rights, that we have the ideal right to be able to trade on the sea. We're not a belligerent, and we should be able to trade with whoever we want to. Well, the problem with this, of course, is that the British are blockading Germany. So no one can trade with Germany. Germany can't get those goods. But Britain controls a blockade. The United States can naturally continue to ship things to them. And so as a result of that, it became kind of a one-sided policy that really, really told the Germans that the United States was effectively joining the British. And that's why I say, is it a practical policy? And that's for you guys to discuss this week, by the way. That's one of the things I want to see you guys discussing is, was Wilson's policy the right policy when it came to neutrality?
The weapons that really made for the stalemate that becomes trench warfare on the Western Front, two of the most significant were the usage of barbed wire and, of course, also the machine gun. And below you see an example of a German Maxim gun. And this picture is one of the many machine guns that would have lined the trenches. And of course above you see an example of the effectiveness of barbed wire. And you see, of course, this depicted in this British Army song from World War I. If you want the old battalion, I know where they are, hanging on the old barbed wire. I've seen them hanging on the old barbed wire. I've seen them hanging on the old barbed wire. This is a British Army song from World War I, and it conveys the reality that barbed wire was an incredibly important defensive development that made these infantry charges that rammed up against the trenches of the other side. It made these infantry charges very difficult, and together these two technologies, these new technologies that are a product of the Industrial Revolution, the machine gun and barbed wire, together these technologies really serve to make the trenches very effective defensive networks that were incredibly devastating to infantry assaults. This is a general look at the trench systems and what the trench systems looked like from a defensive standpoint. Trench systems had dugouts where people could go as far as 15 meters below ground, and people could sleep down there and could generally be safe from shell fire in dugouts. And so you can get an idea here as you can see the troops moving through what would be called no man's land towards the trenches. You can get an idea of just how elaborate some of these trench complexes were. The potential of modern military technology was devastating, and images like this, the rubble conveys just how devastating new military technology was, and of course the causes of this particularly were in advanced developments of long-ranged heavy artillery and explosive shells. Trenches were or become a way of life for soldiers. On the right, you see British soldiers dug into the trenches in the Somme campaign of 1916, and the Somme becomes notoriously deadly for the British armed forces, for the British military. Um, Still today, the first battle of the Somme is the most deadly day of the British military. Mud and water in the trenches, as depicted in the picture below to the left, was also a huge problem for many soldiers fighting in the trenches. And these types of conditions gave rise to a malady called trench foot, which many soldiers would suffer as they would get this sort of skin rot on their foot that was caused by the foot being wet and submerged for long periods of time. So a very, very difficult and uncomfortable environment, but a product of a new industrial war of attrition. The Germans were masters of trench construction, and they adopt a highly developed defensive posture in which you had very, very well developed dugouts. You see the sandbags in this picture in a German dugout area. Of course, the British also used dugouts. Dugouts were, again, as deep as 15 meters under the ground, and these could withstand shell hits from above. And soldiers were often crammed in these areas. They would sleep in these areas, as depicted in this image of British soldiers in a dugout on the Western Front.
Now, I'm going to run through a few slides here. There's not a whole lot of notes, and I know I'm talking kind of fast because I know this is kind of going long, but I think you guys probably find this interesting. I wanted to show you a few slides of the industry, the industrial technology of World War One, because it's a horrifying conflict. It's a conflict. If any of you guys have never read All Quiet on the Western Front, I highly recommend it, but don't expect it to be uplifting. It's a horrible conflict. You see the usage, not only as you see the troops here in these trenches that are still, you can still go visit trenches from World War I today in Europe. But on the Western Front, you had these trenches which would get filled with mud. It was a horrible situation for the troops. This is where the term trench foot, or what they call in Vietnam, jungle rot, where your foot almost gets this rotting, painful development on its skin. This is where it comes from the dampness and the horrible conditions of this industrial warfare. So below you see the usage of gas. World War I is where you see the widespread advent of poison gas, and particularly gases like mustard gas and nerve gas and chlorine gas were particularly prevalent. And they were horrible. They would burn people's lungs. People would spit up blood in parts of their lungs. It was very awful, the injuries that came from the usage of gas. And of course, it was very difficult to use because there were cases in which you would use it, and then after using it, the wind would shift, and your troops would be exposed to it. And so it was a very, very horrifying weapon, what we would today call a weapon of mass destruction. Of course, there's also tanks. This is where you see the first tanks invented. Tanks were designed to the hope was that they could be used to break through the stalemated enemy lines. Ultimately, tanks were really only used for infantry support, as you see here. They weren't used to spearhead armored assaults like you see during World War I. And this is a British tank. The French tanks and the German tanks look a little bit different, but these things were slow, unreliable. It was hot inside of the tanks, and oftentimes they filled up with carbon monoxide, and it would make the operators sick. So it was new technology, but it was really indecisive when it came to trying to break those stalemated lines on the Western Front. Of course, the machine gun was probably the most deadly weapon of the war. The machine gun, allowed to obviously sweep areas with bullets. And the result of this was that in many areas of the most intense battle on the Western Front, a troop's like longevity, if he stood up above, put his head up above the trench, could sometimes be as little as 9 or 10 seconds. The areas between these trenches, like all the trees were destroyed. They became wastelands filled with craters, and the machine gun meant that there was incredible casualty rates for troops because they hadn't adapted to the new kind of warfare yet. And so the way they were trying to break the enemy's lines, to break the stalemate, was to get up out of the trenches and assault the trenches, to basically run your troops and your tanks up against the trenches. But what happened was they would just be open targets for the other side, and it led to absolutely huge casualties. During the First Battle of the Somme in 1915, the British lost 60,000 men, I think, in one day. It was the most deadly day. I think it still is the most deadly day in the history of the British Empire. You can fact check me on that number, but it was the Battle of the Somme. And incredible death rates for, very little real estate, if any at all. Of course, the submarine or U-boat we talked about, you've already seen that's incredibly important in this war. Heavy artillery, and here's an example of, they had these huge, not just more mobile artillery units, but they had these huge railroad guns that they would use, particularly on the Western Front. And artillery, really explosive artillery, long-range artillery, was really a huge factor in the war, and at places like the Battle of Verdun, which was in France. And this resulted in a basically the first type of post-traumatic stress disorder, where artillery shelling was so intense and so prolonged that some troops would have a nervous breakdown. They called it shell shock. And shell shock, people could become completely catatonic, and it was caused by the continual and relentless pounding of these massive explosive shells that would go on for hours and hours and hours at incredible rates. Also, other technologies, of course, the airplane, pictured here, the biplane, of course, Baron von Richthofen, the German, the Red Baron as he was known, was the most well-known of the fighter aces during the war. And of course, Zeppelins. And you see here, this is a service announcement from the British, God Save the King, as you see at the bottom. But these technologies were very, very much in their infancy. Air power was in its infancy and factored, and they used it for reconnaissance, and they would hand drop bombs out of the side of these planes. And they would have the dogfights, and they were kind of a romanticized part of this war. But to be truthful, they were not the kind of decisive thing that could break the enemy lines and break the stalemate. In truth, there was no technology during the war that was capable of that. Hence why it was really a war of attrition. 1917 became an incredibly significant moment in the war. Germany was getting starved out, literally, by the British blockade, and they were unable to break it. Without unrestricted submarine warfare, the Germans really could not, and I'm sorry that's misspelling, but the Germans couldn't win unless they went back to unrestricted U-boat warfare, and they do this in 1917. And then shortly thereafter, of course, the German Foreign Secretary Zimmermann sent a telegram to the Mexicans trying to incite a Mexican attack on the western United States as a way of hoping to preoccupy the United States. And of course, as you guys probably have heard before, this was intercepted. And these two events, the resumption of unrestricted U-boat warfare and the sinking of further ships, and the Zimmermann telegram, led to a declaration of war by Woodrow Wilson in April of 1917. And this became for Wilson a war to end all wars. It became a war to make the world safe for democracy. Also, other events that are very much significant in Wilson's mind at this time, but also significant for the future. Russia goes through the Bolshevik Revolution led by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov Lenin, V.I. Lenin, pictured here. And Lenin, after the success of the communists, after the success of the communist Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And this treaty took the Russians out of the war. And for the first time in the war, the Germans had the chance to focus on one front. And they would launch an offensive to try to win the war in the West. And with American help, the offensive failed in 1918. And that was pretty much the beginning of the end. And the United States and the Allies were able to obtain the surrender from the Germans. The contribution of the United States, we did fight valiantly. It's not to say that the American soldiers didn't fight with great cause and with valiant effort, but we came in late, and our contributions were primarily psychological. That is, when you have troops who've been fighting for 4 years in trenches and they see green American doughboys, as we were called, coming cheering, ready for a fight, well, that's a boost to your confidence. And also in terms of material, supplies. We're in the war now. We're able to help and supply. But it takes the United States, after declaring war in 1917, the United States is not really actually in the war until a year later. It takes us almost a year to really get involved. And so we really only were actually fighting in the war for about 7 or 8 months. At home, the United States, after declaring war, unleashes a very, very intensive kind of propaganda campaign. The Creel Committee oversaw the publication of anti-German publications and flyers like the one you see here. There was other forms of propaganda. People started stopped calling sauerkraut. They would call it Liberty cabbage. People stopped they stopped serving German foods. People even, like Eddie Rickenbacker, who is the greatest American fighter ace during World War II, changed the spelling of his name. He was a German American, and he changed the spelling of his name so he wouldn't look German, and he served the United States with great valor during World War I. I think I said World War II a second ago. During World War I, he was the #1 American fighter ace and shot down more planes than any other American. And Rickenbacker also went on to, he owned the Indianapolis Motor Speedway for a period of time. He raced in the Indianapolis 500. He also was the founder of Pan American Airlines, which you guys is not around anymore, but some of us older folks might remember Pan American. I certainly do. The end of World War I also was kind of a dark time for the United States. The Wilson administration passed a law, the Sedition and Espionage Acts, that basically marginalized free speech in the United States. It made, among other things, it made speaking out against the war effort a prisonable sentence. And of course, as you're reading in this week's primary source documents and in your book, Democracy's Prisoner, Eugene V. Debs was imprisoned for this. And he was imprisoned for a speech that he made at Canton, Ohio in 1917, I'm sorry. And I encourage you to go online and find that speech. It's easy to find and read it. It's a little bit long, but the Canton speech he's a socialist. It's very much a socialist speech. But I think you might be surprised that it was such to lead to his imprisonment for 3 years. So that's a very controversial thing, and I want you to think about this civil liberties during war. I want you to think about it and discuss it this week on our discussion board. Of course, it's also the time of the Black Sox scandal, the gambling scandal with the 1918 World Series involving folks like Shoeless Joe Jackson. I'm sure some of you guys have seen 8 Men Out. There's also a major steel strike. And you say, well, he's mentioning the Black Sox, baseball, wow. Well, no, but baseball at this time was really an important thing, especially at hard times. It was entertainment for people, and it was the big thing for Americans for at least the first half of the 20th century. And so it was a dark time in terms of entertainment. There's also a massive steel strike in 1919 that prompts, because some labor leaders were socialist, and this played in with the Bolshevik Revolution to create a Red Scare in the country, in which the Attorney General Mitchell Palmer went on witch hunting tactics. There were professors who lost their jobs for alleged, socialism or communism. There was a real Red Scare after the Bolshevik Revolution. And of course, too, a lot of people forget that in 1918, 1919, you had the origin of the Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu killed almost 700,000 Americans. It was actually more Americans that died in World War One. And the Spanish flu, in addition to this, the Spanish flu, in terms of one event, it 675,000 is the number, I think, is the accurate number. And that's actually more than any one war has resulted in casualties or deaths for the United States, with the Civil War being around 630,000. During this period when the Spanish flu was really virulent, people did not go out and celebrate. When World War I ended on the 11th day of the 11th month of the 18th year, November 11th, 1918, it was Armistice Day. It was a holiday for years in the United States. But on that day, people didn't go out and celebrate that like they did, as you've seen, at the end of World War II in the United States. People were deathly afraid of getting this violent flu, which killed middle-aged Americans more. It killed people in their 20s and 30s more than it did old folks. Now I'm getting there, guys, so I'm almost done. But I want to go back to Wilson. Wilson, after the war is over, Wilson goes to Versailles in Paris for the peace negotiations, and Wilson hoped to use this as a way to promote what he called his 14 points. And here's listed just a few of them. Obviously not all 14, but the most important ones. And Wilson went to meet people like the British Prime Minister Lloyd George, and they were going to discuss and negotiate the end of the war. Wilson promoted his League of Nations, which the League of Nations was like a collective security, a collection of governments that would all work together to assure fair trade and assure that war was prevented. He wanted to promote free trade, self-determination. Of course, self-determination is going to be challenging because the people that he's got to negotiate with, Clemenceau from France, and of course Orlando from Italy, and Lloyd George from England, those countries are imperial colonial powers, and self-determination is a threat to their empires. Of course, there was also, he wanted free trade and freedom of the seas. He wanted an abolition of secret treaties. These were some of the things that Wilson really fought for at Versailles in Paris at the end of World War I. He also wanted global armament reductions. Now, you might be asking the questions, how successful is he? Sadly, Wilson was not very successful. You'll see here momentarily, the League of Nations is accepted and it becomes an entity, but it was very unfair. And the United States never joined the League of Nations. Wilson hoped for peace without victory. Now think about that. Peace without victory. What does that mean? What does peace without victory mean? It means, in my opinion, it means a fair peace. And for Wilson, it meant a fair peace. It meant not punishing the Germans. But back to the United States, and we'll talk a little bit about Germany in just a moment. Back to the United States. Wilson came home. He had to really compromise his ideals in Europe, in Versailles. The European powers did not buy a lot of his things. And really, all he gets out of it is the League of Nations, the League Treaty as it was called, the League of Nations Covenant. And he comes back, and the French would only agree to the League of Nations treaty if there was a security treaty. And the security treaty meant that if France was attacked by Germany, the British and the United States would agree to come to their aid. Wilson came home and kind of expected the Senate, because the Senate does foreign relations, Wilson expected the Senate to quickly ratify this. And instead, there was a strong opposition from Republicans in Congress. Republicans were angry because the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Henry Cabot Lodge, pictured here, and probably the most qualified to go to the treaty, was left off of the envoy, and instead Wilson went himself. And a lot of Republicans in Congress saw this as an affront. And so Lodge was upset, Lodge's supporters were upset, and it winds up becoming an intense political fight in the United States. And Lodge and his contingent in the Senate will make reservations to Woodrow Wilson's treaty, the League of Nations Treaty. And what basically these reservations are is they said, we will accept and join the League of Nations, but we will not join a security pact, i.e. Henry Cabot Lodge and others do not want to get drawn into another European war. And two, they wanted to protect the Monroe Doctrine. Wilson had inserted some anti-imperialist rhetoric in the treaty, and the Republicans and Democrats were afraid that it might lead to an unraveling of an American empire in Latin America, and they didn't want that. Well, Wilson was defiant, and he goes out on a speaking tour opposing Lodge. Wilson also personally disliked Lodge. Wilson was a PhD. He was this high-minded guy, very idealistic. He thought Lodge was kind of, a simpleton. And Lodge, and that's how Wilson would have thought about it. Lodge and Wilson did not like each other. That was the point. They had personal animosities. And Wilson says to Democrats, he says, do not vote for this. No matter what, don't vote for it. And as a result, the treaty fails. By the way, during this period, Wilson has a stroke. And when he was speaking against Lodge, Wilson suffered a stroke. And he played out the remainder of his presidency largely bedridden. And his wife actually did much of the presidential duties during this time period. But the treaty fails, and the U.S. doesn't join the League. The U.S. also not only does not join the League, we didn't sign a peace treaty with Germany until 1921. So, peace without victory. And this is the last slide, guys. I know this is kind of long today. Peace without victory. Absolutely not. I wanted you to think about that for a second. Peace without victory means that there's a peace, but nobody is excessively punished to the point where such animosities will be built up as to cause another war. That was what Wilson wanted. Prevent other wars. But what actually happened at Versailles was Germany was labeled as the culprit. They invaded through neutral countries was the argument. They used unrestricted submarine warfare. They killed 1,500 people on the Lusitania. And so Germany they were forced to sign a guilt clause where they were labeled as the one responsible for the war. They were forced to maintain a military of no more than 100,000. They could have no heavy artillery or air force, which actually is why the Germans started building rockets. When they start militarizing in the 30s, the Germans start building rockets, and that's one of the reasons why the Germans were the first country to build a ballistic weapon, which of course the V-2 during World War II. That is actually where the technology for the United States moon rocket came from. But that's a different discussion for a different day. The Rhineland, which was an area near with the border of France, a huge area, was demilitarized. It was basically made a pseudo occupied territory on the border of Germany. It was kind of segmented off from Germany. The French were trying to prevent Germany from using it as a place to stage another invasion. They were very afraid of that. There were huge reparations, millions and millions of pounds, if you will, in reparations were placed on Germany, more than they could ever pay back. The result of this period, by the way, I'm sorry I moved that slide too quick because I didn't realize I had this last slide actually. But the reparations in Germany were so huge that it helped lead to economic crises problems in Germany. And historians have often looked at Versailles and said Versailles was so unfair and created such animosities among the German people that it was actually one of the primary tools that the Nazis used, that animosity, when the Nazis began to come to power, which happened in the 1920s, actually. That's when they started to become a political force. And, of course, in the 1930s was when Hitler came to power. And so the failure of Versailles, the fact there was no peace without victory, actually helped lead to the development of the Second World War. Wilson in World War One does represent a dawning of a new century. In a lot of respects, Wilsonian idealism was realized after World War II to some degree with the United Nations. Of course, also decolonization was largely the end of colonial control of places like India, Vietnam, Africa, was to a large degree motivated by Wilsonian rhetoric, as well as the rhetoric of Lenin, by the way. Um, it wasn't necessarily Wilson's immediate intent, but ultimately, when ultimately it probably was, when he believed that those places were quote ready for self governance. The Middle East was fundamentally altered by World War One. The fall of the Ottoman Empire meant that the French and the British were given and authorized by Wilson and other leaders of trusteeships over what we call the Middle East. And basically, the trusteeships were basically chopping up the Middle East and allowing the British and the French to run those areas until they deemed that the people in those areas were fit for self-governance after the fall of the Ottoman. And it's during this time period, Britain controlled Iraq, France, Syria. The British effectively created Kuwait to limit the power of Iraq, which was traditionally one of the centers of power in the Middle East. You also have a growing Jewish nationalism following World War One, and these factors throughout the 20th century are going to continue to be more and more significant, obviously. The way the United States, at last point, and then this is it, and I'm done, but I just want to say that the way the United States ultimately reacted to this war was with inwardness, isolationism, and anger. And during the 1930s, when there was so much that people said the United States should have been doing that they weren't doing in the 1930s to prevent the rise of Nazi Germany, instead, the United States really refused to get involved in European affairs because so many in the United States, including historians in the 1930s, interpreted World War One as a war that was that the United States was drug into because of the self-interest of greedy munitions suppliers. There was a lot of anger and isolationism that resulted from the First World War. It was an unpopular war, and Americans reacted, and that affected the lateness of our involvement in World War II. All right, well, that's it. I'm sorry it was kind of long. Hopefully this is helpful, guys, and send me any message on email if you have any problems or anything. Thank you.